up of this?
Cool.
Not this time.
When we were living in the UK for one of the events that the Queen appeared at, she had this like super bright green jacket on, and then like the next, like people just had a field day, like video people, like all these sort of different like green screen things they could put on her. It was pretty funny. And my favorite was the Joker. They put the Joker, the big question marks on her. That was good.
Oh, cute.
Yeah.
I saw the Queen in 1972.
Wow.
Charlotte, I think it was 72 in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Wow.
She visited the University of Virginia. Yes.
Oh.
It was in the summertime, and we went out to see her and waved at her. So.
Oh my gosh.
Cool.
Let's see who's. Oh, Bennett. Great.
Definitely need Bennett.
Okay, let's give it a couple minutes and we'll get started.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello. Oh, hi, Sasha.
Hi, Bran.
Hi. Let's drop this down.
Oh my God.
The one under it was even better.
Oh, that is too bright.
He's on it. Oh, look, there's Asa with his, what the hell on
Oh, cute.
Okay, so how are you doing that, Luke? Is that like
So you go to video settings,
Oh, okay.
and then you
Zoom feature.
a video filter, which
Yeah.
is under the advanced option. No, that's, I'm sorry.
Zoom added a bunch of crazy filtering capability that allows you to do things like add facial hair and eyebrows.
Wow.
Yeah, they're really.
Can you do it on other participants? That would be really fun.
There we go.
Oh yeah,
See?
nice.
Does this look right?
Perfect.
I tend not to like to do it because it really cuts off bandwidth, but we got small enough crowd.
Oh, that's good.
Wow.
There you go.
Oh, cute.
Where did Asa go?
Wait,
Oh,
that's not a filter. That's real.
That's real.
Yeah. Don't worry, Ace is here.
Asa, where are you?
Hold on a second. Alice, were you trying to say something?
Well, I wanted to know if I'm on or not.
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think we have a quorum. So Rob, it's all yours.
All right. So I'm going to do this. So I'm going to share my screen, and I have a couple of videos, and so at some point I'm going to have to unshare and then reshare. So I apologize in advance for the blips, but bear with me. And so this is really sort of a joint effort, and Amy and I are kind of the main folks in charge of keeping bees here now in Solterra, but also Alice is going to be part of the presentation towards the end, which I'm really excited about. And in the background here is an image. I was lucky enough to go to The Hague last year for work, and if you've ever been there or ever get a chance to go there someday, there's an Escher museum, and it's really amazing, whether or not you're a super Escher fan, but they have this whole thing was a walk around mural. And so it was probably like 10 feet in diameter maybe, and you could just walk all the way around. It was all sort of animals morphing into one another. And this, I of course like the bees, so that was that. So I will stress that I'm a novice beekeeper, even though I guess I've been doing a little bit a while, but if there are any hard questions, I may punt on them and and basically come back to you with answers. But basically what I'm going to try to do is a little bit of background on honeybees. They're really complex, so this is going to be super brief, and there'll be lots of things that I gloss over. And so if there are other things you want to know about, just shoot me an email. Basically some images and some fun videos of what we've done in Solterra this year with starting out, I think we had 3 hives, then we got up to 6, and then we're now at 4. So basically talk a little bit about the process of maintaining them throughout the year. And then afterwards, last year, I think it was last year, I was delivering some honey to Allison Bennett. It was definitely pre-pandemic, I know that because I was in their house for a while. And she started telling me about some of her experiences growing up in Eastern North Carolina, and it involves honey. So she was kind enough to offer to tell a little bit about some experiences she had with bees. So I got a couple of photos and a few sort of hand-drawn Google Maps towards the end. So basically, I'm going to try to do a little bit of this. Again, they're super complicated. I mean, people do spend their scientific careers, let alone just sort of hobbies, keeping track of bees and keeping care of them and whatnot. So again, I'm novice, so I'm still learning. But basically, a little bit about who's in the hive and sort of what bees do, kind of the roles that they each have, and what a year in the life sort of a hive looks like. And I've borrowed a lot of slides and images from a website called Scientific Beekeeping, which is a commercial beekeeper out in California. But some of the slides are for the timing of sort of the growth and decay of a hive over a year, based in Canada, actually. So I'll come back to that and bear that in mind when we talk about hives in North Carolina. And a couple of the issues that beekeepers face, one of the biggest ones is Varroa, and we have those here. So if you've ever seen us up in the garden treating, or in front of Amy's house treating, it's often for Varroa, and I'll show some pictures of that and talk a little bit more about those as we go on. So at the peak of summertime, there are anywhere from sort of 40 to 60,000 bees in a hive, which is pretty amazing. And it never fails to amaze me every time I sort of open one up and look at a frame full of bees. I mean, they're super, super fascinating. They're also a little scary because the stings hurt. And so I've kind of gotten over that a little bit. I haven't been stung in a while too, which also benefits that sort of fascination. But in the middle here is a shot of a big queen. And she has this, what they call a retinue, that sort of take care of her and sort of tend to her, because she's very important, but she's also fungible, which is interesting phenomena, and we'll see about that. But you can identify her by this big, huge abdomen. And still, sort of, we're talking something that's maybe an inch long. And so when you have 50,000 of these things, you think like, wow, it's so obvious when there's a still photo, and you can spend quite a bit of time searching in vain for her. But it's a good idea to try to keep track of her, where she is in the colony, and evidence of her, which I'll talk a little bit about. The vast majority are the female workers. And so this all around here, I don't know if I have any shots of any drones in here, maybe a illustration of one. And they're actually sort of the brains of the hive. You think of the queen being in charge, but really it's the workers that are responsible for kind of the biology of the hive. And drones are the males, and their sort of sole job is to mate with the queen. And at the end of the year, they all die and they're booted out of the hive. I think a handful overwinter, but they mostly die. So that's that. And just one thing, Lois and Alan, I don't know if they're on, but if they're not, this is a picture of Ryan, who used to be the beekeeper in Solterra that we are paying to sort of help keep bees. And I guess whoever started with the hives originally in Solterra had gotten in touch with Ryan. So when I started taking over that, we just kind of inherited working with him. And this is a queen. And so as you saw from that previous slide, she can be really hard to spot. And so a good practice, although a hard practice, is to mark the queen. And so basically we caught a swarm, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. This was 2 years ago, I think. We caught a swarm and then found the queen and comically captured her. It was very funny, and we looked rather amateurish. And then Ryan, he's shown here, was marking it with this color, and the colors go by year. So I think they cycle every 4 years, but maybe it's every 5 years. But if you mark a queen, you use this year's color, whichever, I don't know what color this year is. But it was really funny because I always thought Ryan, like, super expert in all this stuff, and he actually has a side business doing this. And right at the point where he's about to break out the marker, he said, "I've never done this before." I was like, really? I can't believe that. But I think Alan has a video of us trying to capture the swarm, and it was pretty comical. But we'll see a different video of that later on. So yeah, here's an illustration, obviously not to scale, but just to show you the rough sort of size comparison of them. The males are at the right, and they're kind of big and fat, so they're big enough that they'll trick your eye, and you're like, oh, there's the queen, and then it's like, no, it's not the queen. And that sort of long tapered abdomen is really the key feature of the queen. That's sort of just, you know, it's a good clue to figure out who's who and where she is. Yeah, and like I said, this is from the scientific beekeeping website. And basically this sort of idea that as queens live longer than other ones, but basically they don't get better with age. And so they start to get weaker, or she starts to get weaker. And in particular, she doesn't emit as much pheromones. So in a crowded hive with a weak queen, the workers don't smell enough of her scent. And they're basically, wow, the queen's not doing a good job. And they'll get rid of her. And so I thought this sort of idea, this fungible ovary, was sort of an interesting way to think about it. And we've experienced that several times throughout this year. We've said like, okay, we saw a queen, and the next time we went in, the queen wasn't there, and the workers have just decided to replace her. So kind of an interesting concept. How long they live, these are for adult worker bees. So basically time is on the x-axis here on the bottom, and then percent alive is on the y-axis. So I think the average is about 16 days, but they can live you know, upwards of a month. Some sort of in extreme cases. The queen bees can live upwards of 3 to 4 years, but usually after about 2 years, she's not quite as fecund, basically, as she used to be, and it's a good time to replace her. Either you do it as a beekeeper, or the workers will do it for you. Okay, and so oftentimes when we're looking in the hive to basically do an inspection, you want to see the queen, because that just sort of is a good sort of indication of what's going on. And especially if you're going to do any treatment, you really want to make sure that you see her, because otherwise, you know, if you inadvertently kill her, that would be really bad. But this is one of the things you look for. And so just to kind of show a few different things, obviously we see lots of workers here, and there's my cursors. These are all workers. This is pollen that the bees have brought in, and they pack into these cells, and they use it for food in a similar way they do with honey. But it's interesting actually, because they stack this in layers, and they actually ferment the pollen so that it lasts longer, and they can use it over the winter when there's not as much food out there. I think this one here shows, I think this one is hard to tell with a little bit of a glare, but that's an egg. So the eggs are teeny tiny. So you want to see evidence of that the queen is actually laying eggs. So if you see things like that, that's good. This is actually a brood frame that someone's sort of blown the workers off. It's usually dense with bees, so it's actually hard to see that. This is what's called uncapped brood. So these are developing workers in this case, and this is capped brood. So as they get old enough, then the worker bees will cap this, and then so they have their last period before they emerge out of the cell. And Amy and I saw that several times this year, watch them sort of come out and kind of be born, which was really cool, actually, kind of fascinating to see. So that's sort of what you look for. And this is zoomed in on the brood frame, but you know, they're sort of yay big, basically, by about that high. And so you want to sort of see the general pattern. So this is zoomed in, but you sort of want to look if the queen's laying really consistently and kind of cleanly over the frame. And I'll show you a picture later on of a case where that was not happening. And actually the hive ended up dying this summer, which was sad. So bear in mind, I mentioned this at the outset, these are the sort of rough kind of growth and then decline of the colony throughout the year. These dates are sort of irrelevant. They're from Canada, not from North Carolina, but basically the shape of it is the same, just the shifts on the growth and decline are different as you go sort of further south or further north. So we generally see a little bit sort of earlier growth down here than you would see in farther north, of course, just because of weather. And this is from Manitoba, but this gives you a little bit more of an idea. Again, this is a year's worth of time on the sort of the bottom line. And then you see the increase in the overall size of the hive, with peaks around we're sort of past the peak at this point, but sort of July, August time, you see the most number of bees that are in the hive typically. And then I'll come back to this, I'll overlay on this later on. You see a secondary growth of the pests, and that's really hard. You have to sort of manage that, because the growth of the pests, in particular the Varroa, tend to lag behind the growth of the bees. And so you have to be careful about your treatment so that the Varroa just don't totally overwhelm the colony, and then they'll all die. But there's a challenge here, of course, to sort of manage that throughout the summer. And then as we get into fall, as we're getting on now, to sort of start feeding a little bit to make sure that the hive can get through the winter. And you also don't leave too much space, because as the hive shrinks in numbers, if there's too much empty space in the hive, basically they're vulnerable to attack by beetles. So they don't basically, if you keep it sort of compact, then they don't have to defend as much territory. Defend to pests, or in particular, some cases, other hives itself. So this is the beastie that most people, most beekeepers have to struggle with. And I'll talk a little bit about this actually in relation to what Alice is going to talk about, in terms of this first came into the US in, I think, the late 80s. And so when Alice is talking about the beekeeper that was, I don't want to sort of steal her thunder, but basically the beekeeper was able to set up hives on her father's land and not have to check them regularly. But you can't do that nowadays, because Varroa they'll overwhelm the hive, and they'll die really quickly. So they're quite small. You can see them with your eye, especially if it's sunny out, because they kind of have a hard shell, and so they'll reflect the light pretty well. My eyes are failing, sadly. So sometimes I can see them better than others, but you can see them on the back of a bee. And in terms of the size in relation to the bee, it would be, I saw a picture of it in a bee class I took last year. It would be as if we had something that was about that big. So on your back or whatnot. And they can live all over the bee. And in particular, they can get up into their abdomen and eat their fat stores, and then, just sort of weaken the individual bees. So they're really bad. And then there's a picture, just to sort of give you an idea. That's a worker bee, so you can see the size of that beetle. Sorry for this slide, screwed up the order, but you can see the size of that in relation to the size of the bee. So if you can see the Varroa with your naked eye, then that's a sign that you need to treat the colony for sure, because they're hard to see. And with 50,000 bees, you're liable to miss a lot of them. This is an old slide. This is sort of showing some of the spread of Varroa into the U.S. So came in, I think said into Florida from a container ship in the late 80s, and then has sort of spread across the U.S. So basically, it's in every state. I assume it's in Hawaii, but I don't know for sure. So if you're a beekeeper in the U.S., you have to deal with this. And when I was in Scotland, the beekeepers had to deal with it there as well. So it's a real drag. So I wanted to show this one too, because basically this sort of reinforces what I was talking about earlier about, the hive that's in the kind of the yellow or goldenrod line there, will kind of have this natural buildup throughout the year and then decline as they get towards overwintering. And the buildup of the mites will lag that. And so since we've been talking a lot in coronavirus world about the R rate, this is the same idea. So you sort of basically live with mites being in the colony, but you want to reduce their reproduction rate, and so you have fewer in the colony, and they're not as hard on the bees. And so the idea with treatment is that you drop from the red line down to the green line, which so therefore means there are fewer mites in the colony. And the problem here is these will build up later in the year as the number of bees are declining, and there's not as much, of course, out there for the bees to forage on. So you get into this sort of kind of vulnerable period where you really need to be careful. And I don't know if I have a shot of the treatment we did, but Amy and I just checked today's the 25th. So we just checked last Sunday, and the treatment we had on there was called Apivar, and that was on there for, I think, 5 weeks. So it's actually a long, slow releasing chemical. And again, this just sort of restates what I just showed in that previous slide, where you get the buildup of the sort of healthy brood, and you have to manage the Varroa, because otherwise you can get this vulnerable period where the population will just get overwhelmed and they'll die really quickly. And they get weakened too. So it's not necessarily like the Varroa kill them, but it's just they weaken them, and so they're vulnerable to predation from other things, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So this is another little beastie called the small hive beetle, and the 2 hives that are in front of Amy and Sandy's house have some of these, and they're more a pest. They're not as bad as the Varroa, which are really can be lethal to the hive. But for instance, here, and this is a picture I took 2 weekends ago after we'd fed them. These are a bunch of now dead small hive beetles who've been feeding one hive with a bag full of sugar. So the bees can't kill them because they have this sort of hard carapace on the back. And so you'll see them. It's actually kind of fascinating to watch. Like you'll see the workers trying to sting them to kill them, but they can't. So they just sort of corral them around. But there's this weird thing where sometimes actually they can put them into a spot in the hive and then actually feed them. So it's this some weird ecology going on, but that's one of the beasts. And then another one is the wax moth. And the hive on the left, I forget when I took this picture, but this was probably in May. So this is up in our garden. And just to orient everyone, this hive in the front is the hive that's been sort of the Solterra hive, for lack of a better word. That was the kind of original one that was here when I started taking over the management of those. But the hive on the left produced a ton of honey and then died, sadly. And it was sort of overrun by these wax moths. Although again, I don't think that was the actual proximate cause of death, but it was the ultimate cause, sadly. So these can be pretty bad, these wax moth, and I'll show a slide of the damage they can do to the brood. So there are a lot of things you have to do to keep them sort of healthy and happy, and a lot of things you have to keep your eye on. Again, same shot of the small hive beetles on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is what a damaged frame will look like. So this was a honey frame. And all of this is this sort of wax moth larvae. I don't know if I actually have any, if you can see any in there, but they just ruin they go through they just eat the honey and they just ruin them. It was actually really sad to see. I didn't cry, but I wanted to. And then this is just another shot of them, of this same hive. But sort of happily enough, this is actually on the outside of Sandy and Amy's house. This is that bee pollen that I mentioned a couple of slides back, and this is a bumblebee foraging on that bee pollen. So different species taking advantage of that. So that was kind of cool. So this was the hive before it died, or sorry, this is a frame before it died. And in the back here in the genes is the local, for several counties. He's the local bee inspector. And you can see in the contrast to what I mentioned several times about how you want to have this really sort of dense, solid pattern of capped brood, so clear that the queen's laying and things are, and the workers are developing. This is this really sort of checkerboard, kind of not so good looking pattern. And we had thought what was going on, we had something called foul brood. And in particular, there are two varieties of that, but American foul brood, you basically have to burn the whole hive because you can't, it lasts for apparently 40 years once it's in a hive. It actually at NC State, they have a big bee research department over there, and they have a gas chamber for hives that have been infected by this. But so he came out, he was great. Actually, it was really amazing to watch him work the hive because he really knew what he was doing. And what he thought is that basically we had a case where there was a swarm, which I'll talk about in another couple of slides here. And then in the process of the new queen or the young queen coming into the hive and taking over, that there was a gap in that, and that basically cycle got broken. And then we just sort of had this kind of dying colony, which was really sad. So that's that. Okay, so those are sort of some of the bad things we have to deal with. This is Ryan on the left-hand side. I'm going to show a funny video in a minute. This is, I think, from March or maybe April. There were two swarms up in Amy and Sandy's yard, and we managed to catch one, and the other was so high up. It was actually may have been in our yard, technically in a tree in our yard, and we missed that one. But I'll show a funny video of us trying to capture that. And this is a little bumblebee. I don't know what species it is that we pulled out of the hive just last Sunday. And this is Amy, of course. She's wearing her COVID appropriate beekeeping gear. And we did a check on these hives last Sunday after that long treatment to see what the mite count was. So this is Ryan, just to sort of show a picture of him. So I'm sure several of you have, and Lois, of course, have seen him around over the last couple of years. And one of the things that we want to do when we test for these mites, I got out of order there, but I wanted to show what Ryan looked as opposed to on the left-hand side in the veil. One of the things you want to do when you do these tests, there are a couple of different ways to test for the mites. One of which is actually you take a jar full of powdered, not full of powdered sugar, but with powdered sugar in it, and you capture about, say, 300 bees or so, and you shake them all up and coat them in the sugar. and then you have a mason jar with a screen, and then you sort of dump it out. You sort of shake out the sugar basically, and what happens is the sugar sinks and the mites float. And so, because the bees don't like the sugar, and so they clean themselves like crazy. And this is a way to get an approximate count. And so, actually, this was a pretty high count. I've just flagged one of these, but I think there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 8, maybe 9 Varroa in here. So this is a sign like, okay, the colony needs to be treated. So you basically you count the number of mites, and then you divide by 300 to get your percentage. More recently, Amy and I did an alcohol wash, and that's like, well, we did a windshield wiper wash, and that's what's shown here with the windshield wiper fluid, and then this little handy dandy thing down at the bottom here in orange with the orange cap. And this is really accurate, but the sad thing is you have to kill the number of bees to get that test. So a little bit of a trade-off. The flip side is if you get a good number, you have a better idea about treating the colony. So we've only done that particular test once, whereas most of the year we've done sugar shakes, which are fun. And this I took Sunday. This is one of the ones up in the garden. And this is actually a really interesting one. I'll show another slide too of this. This one was full of drones, and I actually think we had another queen event in this one. This was different. And this is early. This picture was on Sunday, but the queen event was earlier in this year. But when you open up a hive, this is kind of what it looks like. So this is pretty healthy. They're not at the peak, but you can see there are a lot of bees in there, which is kind of cool. So in this one, basically, we were getting in this place where in kind of before the peak nectar flow, which is May, obviously depends on the weather in the spring, but you want to make sure that the hive is really healthy and happy kind of getting into that, because that's the chance to build up the flow to be able to get honey. And so you're checking them pretty regularly, like once a week we were checking them, whereas now we're doing it about once a month. And this one hive, as you look at the hives up in the garden, it's the one at the back right, there were just lots of like a ton of drones, and they were all really grumpy. And every time you get in there, they were sort of just menacing and whatnot. And we couldn't find the queen. And of course, it can be about a 3-week cycle. And so eventually we decided, like, okay, well, this one needed a new queen. Excuse me. So I went up to Bailey's, which is a bee store up in Hillsborough, or sort of the bee store in the area, and bought a queen. So it's about $30 to get a mated queen. And she's in this little box here on the left-hand side. And so this is kind of a clever little box, tiny little wood box that's maybe 3.5 inches or something like that tall, and each side of it has mesh screen so that the new bees can smell her. So you have this delicate balance where you want to introduce the queen, but if you just let her loose in there, they'd kill her instantly, because they'd sort of perceive her as a foreign kind of threat to the colony. So in this little hole up here is sugar. So it's basically hardened sugar. And so you put this in, and then it takes a couple of days for the worker bees to chew out this sugar and release the queen. Basically, that's what happens. And so the idea is that during that 3 days, the hive gets used to her smell, and they're like, oh, okay, she's fine. We'll accept her. So this was, again, speaking of being a novice beekeeper, this was me, like just putting this in there, and you have to get this hive out, which, as we saw from the previous picture, is covered with bees, and then put her on that in this cage, and then wrap a huge rubber band around this. And this was definitely a comical moment. I was sweating buckets by the time I was done with this. But that's it on the outside. And this is what it looks like when placed in the side. Now you can see a little bit of that sugar at the top there. And so you leave her in there for a couple of days, and then you go back and check to make sure that she's been released. Because if she's in there too long, she'll die, just because there's not enough food for her. So it was worked, actually, and we ended up getting a lot of honey out of this hive. But this was a comical, I've never done this before, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen moment for us this year. Just another shot. This is of the front. You probably see this, especially as it's been warmer this summer. You'll see this kind of in the evenings. The bees will come out and beard. And it sort of depends on the hive. Some do it more than others. The Solterra hive, which this one is, did it a lot. So oftentimes you'd walk up in the garden, you'd see this kind of covered out. It seems to be a thermoregulation issue, to the best people know. Okay, swarms. So this is an exciting part of bee biology, and something speaking of needing to learn more about, this is me. Again, ignore the timing here, but basically what's happening is it's a natural sort of impulse of the hive to, sort of to basically reproduce. And you need to sort of capture the timing of that, because ideally from a bee management standpoint, it's a drag if they swarm, because, 10 to 20,000 bees leave the hive. And it often happens right before the nectar flow. So then instead of having, 40,000 bees, all of a sudden you have 20,000 bees, and then, the honey production will be a lot lower. And so this year we had several, I think actually at least 5, possibly 6, at least 5 I know for sure. And so next year I have to get better about that. And it's one of those sort of things that you can still know what you're doing, which I don't think I really do at this point, but you can know what you're doing and it still happens. And apparently this was a really big year in the area in North Carolina for swarms. This was a swarm in just right by the shed, basically. So right across from Javier and Ayana's house. And this was pretty easy because this was just at about maybe 7 feet high. And so what I did, or Amy and I did this together, we got a small box underneath it and just bent the branch down and then just did like a big shake like that. And so I'll show the video because it's kind of cool. So let me just stop sharing. I got to go to a different screen here. And hopefully, actually, wait, let me stop for 1 second, make sure I share my sound. I do. Okay, good. Okay, so this is about a minute. So can people see this?
That was awesome. Damn, Ryan should have seen that.
So this is right after we've gone right on top of the box.
Man, look at them forging in there. Look at that. Do you see them all swinging in there?
Yeah.
That's just
a little narration for me and Amy. There's a lot of bees.
That is awesome. That is most awesome.
I'm going to stop it right. I'm going to go back for just 1 second because there is a critical thing right there. Can you see my cursor? Pretty sure that's the queen walking into the hive. You can see the size of her in that big long abdomen. Look at that fan. That is so amazing. So what they're doing is they actually have a thing right above the stinger called a Nasonoff gland, I guess after Dr. Nasonoff probably, who figured this out. And they kind of cock the very end of their tail. These are the workers. And they sort of start emitting a pheromone, and then they fan to kind of produce the pheromone and spread it. And so other bees can say like, oh, okay, right, we got to go that way. And I'll show another shot of this later on. So that's one. And then back to, I'm lost in my slides. Where we go? Here, there's that. Okay. Nope, did the wrong thing. There we go. Okay, and then that's after the fact that we put the lid on, and then they sort of made their way happily in. And so here's another funny shot. Anyone who sort of saw this, I think actually Brett probably saw this earlier in the year. That's me on the ladder. That's Amy. Don't try this at home. This is for any of you who used to watch. We had the Jim Fowler joke a while ago. Right up there above my head is a big, massive swarm of bees. And so I'm going to stop again, and we'll show a video here of that, which was comical, but effective, actually. The hive's done really well. Okay.
Okay. Hold it up like it's a cup, man.
That's Ryan, emergency helper. So you can see the, I can't look up, so.
Oh.
That's Ricky.
Oh, they're like coming off. Oh, that is so amazing. It's raining bees. You're just shaking them into the.
You see my face here, I'm like grimacing.
Yeah, and they're still all over. So, I don't think we're going to get many more off.
So that was very, very funny, and terrifying too at the same time. But we got that captured, and it's actually done really well. If you look at Amy's house, it's the hive to the left, Amy and Sandy. So so that was really fun. And then just to show this, actually, this is a little tip that I got from the guy whose name was Don Hopkins, who came out to inspect. He's the county inspector, not just Durham County. And sometimes when you get bees off a frame, and say if you're doing a sugar shake or something like that, you want to get them back in, or you want to say take them off the hive. Like basically you'll take a whole box off the hive and you want to get rid of these bees. And so this is a cool little tip that he shot me. This is a cover that you basically wedge into the entrance, and then you dump them on there. And I talked about that a slide or two ago, about that Nasonoff gland. And you can't really see it close up here, but these workers will line up and they'll fan, and basically all the bees are sort of flying in, use that to orient, which is really kind of fascinating biology to watch. We ended up stacking 2 hives. So Amy used to have 3 in front of her house, and now there's 2. And so the middle one also was without a queen. And so we took that and put on top. And again, because the queens, the new queens can be perceived as a threat, you put this little bit of newspaper on, and this is probably about a week's worth, and they just chew through it. And then they're porous, or it's porous, so that you can sort of smell the pheromones going back and forth, but there's enough of a barrier that it doesn't cause immediate bee death. Okay, so that's basically what I had to say. And again, just to kind of to introduce Alice, well, not that she needs an introduction, but I guess why she's in here, just to remind you, like I took Ben and Alice some honey, I think last year, and then we got to talking, and so Alice was telling some about her experience with having hives in her property. And so I've taken, we've sort of worked the last day or so, but just to orient everyone to where Alice grew up. We're obviously in Durham. That's my house in the blue dot there on the left. And then the red marker on Google Maps here is approximately where Alice grew up, and I think it's in Martin County. So I'll just show this next one, and then I'll just hand it over to Alice, but I'll leave this picture up. So this is just to zoom in on that area between Williamston and Jamesville. One last zoom, and then I'll turn it over to Alice.
Alice?
Yes. Yes, the blue writing on there I added, and I grew up in the Roanoke River bottom land. And the Roanoke River, where it says Jamesville on the right, and it's marked a little darker. Jamesville, and going from east to west toward Williamston, is along US 64. And it is on a bluff. And the Roanoke River zigzags. And if you look at Martin County, it's got the lower edge of the county is just a wiggle back and forth. And it's because it follows the Roanoke River. And Burt T County is above it. But anything that happens in the Roanoke River belongs to Burt T County. So if you drown in the Roanoke River, you have to be taken to Windsor or that way. You don't go to Greenville or Williamston to try to revive you. But my grandfather grew up on the south side of 64. And as a young man, he went down the big hill off 64 into what they call the islands. I need a drink of water. Which is where I grew up. And it was swampland, precocians. It flooded, and he acquired about 25 cents an acre. He had a total of 3,000 acres. Not all of them on the east side of 64, but it was 5 miles from the house he built in 1900 to Devil's Gut, and that was all his land. But he had to clear it, and it was very sandy, and it was hard to grow stuff. But he had a very successful farm, peanuts, corn, commercial sweet potatoes, the soybeans. He would not grow tobacco. But anyway, I was the oldest grandchild, and my father bought 100 acres next to Granddaddy's, and it's marked. There's a little rectangle there. So as far as the lines of who knows where, what, it's just not accurate. But so early on, Granddaddy had to clear land and start a farm. And of course there were honeybees in swarms, and he, figured out how to get them into hives, and he had honey. And there was this man called Hawks, who was in the mountains of North Carolina, producing sourwood honey, which was, a treat. But he found out about the Tupelo honey, and he came down and made acquaintance with Granddaddy, and they came to an agreement. He would put 100 beehives up on legs, in a glade in the woods, and for the rent would be just to give Granddaddy cases of honey. And it was Tupelo honey, which is very wonderful stuff and very rare. So anyway, he would come and bring this great long truck, and he would bring hives and set them up early in the spring. And when I was chopping peanuts or corn in the long fields, we would hear that if we got to the upper end of the field, we'd hear this loud humming from all those bees. And there would be little fluffy things blowing through the fields. And it was the Tupelo blossoms, or tiny little white fluffy things. And so that would go on for like 2 or 3 weeks in the spring. And then he would come and set everything up and go back to the mountains. And then at the proper time, he'd come back and, harvest. We didn't have any mites. We didn't have any, there were no problems. And we didn't even have bears, which now we do have. The bears have come down, and my cousin has had to put up electric fence around he's got a few beehives. But the Tupelo honey is really wonderful stuff. But anyway, my next to, here we go. This was in the local paper, and it's a reprint. And this is Hawks. They called him Old Man Hawks, but he wasn't all that old. And this tells about, I can read it to you. B-Man receives large shipment Friday. L.W. Hawks, owner and operator of Hawks Honey Farms, Williamston. I think he gave up mostly, he came and concentrated on the Martin County swamp honey, is shown with a shipment of 65 cartons of bees from Moultrie, Georgia, which were delivered by the Postal Service Friday morning. The bees in knots in the cartons are shown on roll cart on the rear platform of the post office in Williamston. The bees will be placed in hives in various parts of the area around Williamston and will begin producing honey in a few weeks. It is one of the largest shipments ever to come through the county. Hawks said any resident seeing a swarm of bees should call him, and he would get them as a public service. He'll go get them. He'll be happy to go get them. And back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when Granddaddy died in 56, and my uncle, who was in charge of stuff and bizarre, weird, he and Mr. Hawks had a disagreement, and he wouldn't let him come anymore. But the only rent was to give us quart jars, beautiful jars, cases of honey, which was wonderful. And And this is one from, I don't know when, it's so old, but it's Pure Natural Honey, Forestland Honey Farm, Route 1, Williamston, NC. And that was our address, Route 1. But anyway, net weight 1 pound 5 ounces. And it's got a cowboy on a horse. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but anyway, the swampland, like I said, there were so many acres of it, and so much tupelo gum trees and cypress. Of course, the cypress doesn't lend itself to honey. But anyway, during the war, we didn't need to use our sugar ration coupons. We could give them away because we had all this honey, and we also World War II for you young'uns. We also made molasses, and I've helped strip the canes. The sugar cane is really tall, and cut off the brown seed heads, and then somebody with a molasses mill would come, and they'd hitch up a mule, and they'd go around and squeeze out the juice from the cane, and then they would have a copper thing that looked like in this the new Our State magazine tells about maple syrup production up in Ashe County, North Carolina, and they have when we were in New Hampshire, we saw the same kind of pans, evaporators, and anyway, these are now made out of steel. But the ones that we would, the guys would come and would pay them to do it, were made out of copper. And you'd put a fire under it with wood and evaporate out. Now for maple syrup, it takes about 60 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. And I don't know about the molasses, but the rectangular pan had channels, and you put the syrup, the sap, the juice in at the top, and then you had a pusher, a rectangular thing, and you would push it up and down, and when it finally came to the point on the lower far end where it would run out into the half-gallon jars, no, it wouldn't be in jars immediately because it was too hot. We would put them in half-gallon jars, but anyway, it would be molasses at that point. But I think now they just have evaporator pans that don't have the channels. But anyway, so we had molasses and we had honey, so we had plenty of sugar. So anyway, I'll give you too much information and go down a rabbit hole. So
tell them about the farm. Granddaddy cleared land, nickel an acre, and 3,000 acres.
No, he had 3,000 acres total. Most of it was swamp. And he paid 25 cents an acre for the swampland. But, and on that other thing, what did I write here? It says, this was in 1974. Hawks was based in the mountains of North Carolina, originally producing sourwood honey, 40s, 50s, and 60s. That's when he had 100 hives on Granddaddy's land. But my father was one of 6 sons, and he was the only one who stayed and looked after stuff for Granddaddy. And he bought 100 acres from land next door to Granddaddy's, which is now owned by the Nature Conservancy. And that was the King Charles III, I think, the land grants, Smithwick's. And one of the women was a Gray, and Daddy was kin to the Grays, so he was able to buy 100 acres. That was the only land that came out of that land grant, which now belongs to the Nature Conservancy. And it's right next to Daddy's little dab, and that's where we live. If you go in and take a tour with the Nature Conservancy off Highway 64 on, I think it's Highway 115, 5115, you go down on 64, you go a few hundred yards and then you go down this steep hill and you cross what we used to call the big swamp. And sometimes we couldn't go to school. Sometimes we've been to school on canoes, and sometimes go to Jamesville and stay with grandparents for school. But there was a flood in 1941 and flooded everything, and water sat in our little house. That was before we built another house for 2 weeks. That's another story. Don't let me get started on all that. But anyway, any questions? Nope.
I have just one thing to add. Alice also had some pictures from an article from New York Times from last May about Tupelo honey farming, basically south of here, so sort of more Georgia, Florida. But Brand, I'll send you this link. It's actually some really nice pictures on it. But here's, yeah, just sort of, I think these are in Florida, is where these guys were handling these hives. But here's what a Tupelo cypress swamp looks like.
Wow.
I'm not exactly sure I'd want to be waiting in there checking on hives, I have to admit.
I have a comment and a question for each of you. This is Matt. First, Alice. Alice, say something so I can see your face.
Okay, who's talking to me?
This is Matt Longley.
Oh, hey, Matt. Yeah.
How you doing, darling? That was delightful. It was so much fun to see the maps and to hear the stories.
I've got lots of stories. Don't get me started.
That's true. I'm going to ask about that thing you have around your neck.
Oh, yes. Yes. This is in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I've got lots of old stuff. I've got more of this kind of stuff if anybody's interested. If you need anything old, ask me.
It looks
yeah,
like
it's a I don't know whether you can see it. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I noticed that too.
Can you tell where you got it, Penny Garden?
I don't think so.
I really enjoyed your stories, Alice. I feel like we should have storytelling night. This really takes me back because my grandparents would drive up to the mountains, and I think they were just babysitting me, but I wound up going with them a lot of weekends, and I would just sit around and listen to people tell stories, and it kind of reminded me of that. Eli's over here wiggling, and I think that was me back then. But my grandparents had some bee stories too. When I was little, they had a guy that would come down from the Virginia mountains and like grab their bees, and he said that they didn't need to pay him, just he would give them some honey, but that it cured his arthritis, and that he liked to capture the bees and get stung because he had terrible arthritis, and it was like the only thing that gave him any relief was to get stung by the bees. So he would come down several times a year and like look in their trees and try to find bees.
Well, you're right. Bee stings are a known antidote to help with arthritis. And one thing that we didn't think about, it's wonderful to have local honey because the terroir, or whatever you talk about, the soil and the air and everything, if you have any kind of sensitivity to food or allergies, local honey is what you need, not honey from somewhere else. You're supposed to have your own local area honey.
Well, Solterra honey is about as local as it gets, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So thank you, Robin.
So Kathy, one of the ideas we had was that everybody gets together and tells 5-minute stories. Should we go ahead and do that?
Right now? No.
No, I mean, schedule it.
Yeah, like the Monty, right?
Yeah, right.
Or maybe Alice could just tell more stories.
I have a quick question.
Would say, don't get me started.
I have a quick question for Rob. You had a picture of a bumblebee in the hive.
What?
Yeah.
What are bumblebees doing in hives?
So it was in, we have on every hive right now, I think we have a top feeder. And so basically, since there's not a lot out in the landscape that they're bringing, there is some stuff, but there's not as much as there was earlier in the spring, of course. So probably every 2 weeks, we'll put in some sugar water. And so I think they've gotten in there and are just snacking. Unfortunately, you'll see a bunch of cockroaches in there, which are disgusting, but
why don't the honeybees kill them?
I don't know, actually. Well, I saw them trying to kill a bumblebee up at the hive, one of the hives in the garden, and you could see it repeatedly stinging the bumblebee, but he or she was tough. So I don't know. Yeah, the roaches they're too big, and they have a hard exoskeleton, I guess, so they're not.
I know sometimes mice live in honeybee hives.
Yeah. Yep.
That seems like the life and not the life. Like all the honey.
Yeah, our
you
son
eat
used
and
to have bees, and but where he lives now, he can't. It's nothing but shade and no place. But he came home one day at lunchtime, and there was this noise. He got out of the car and he heard this noise, and he looked in the back of it. Had this huge, like a park, and on his back lot, and there was the bees had come and were swarming above the hive, and he ran inside and called the guy that they worked together, and by the time he got back out, they had left, and they never could find where they went. But they decided, I guess there were too many bees in the hive. Is that what happens? They took off.
Yeah, so as much as I've tried to figure out what causes it, and just looking out on sort of beekeeping websites and books, it's one of the thoughts is that the bees are one of the sort of theories is it gets too crowded, and the queen, I think I mentioned that she can her pheromones can weaken with age, but sometimes they can also, even if she's like cranking out the pheromones, that if it's too crowded, that workers basically can't smell her. And then some will be like, okay, the queen's weak, and we need to develop a new young queen and then kick out the old one. So, but I think there's so that's one theory, and I think there's a lot of things that people don't know, certainly including me, about what causes it.
Rob, what race of bees do you have? Do you know?
What? Sorry, Buck?
I know there's different races of bees that you can.
Oh, I think they're the Italians.
Okay. Well, I know the first bees I got from Jack Tapp in Hillsboro. He's dead by now, but anyway, they were the so-called Minnesota hygienic bees. Have you heard of those?
I have not. No. What are they?
They, this a professor at the University of Minnesota.
Wow, let's speak up.
Bees are hygienic, all bees are hygienic in that they clean out dead bodies and stuff out of the hive.
Yeah.
But she successfully, over several generations, just selected bees that were more hygienic than others on the theory that they would get rid of the more mites. And supposedly that's true, that the Minnesota hygienic bees, you don't have as much problem with mites because they clean the hive out better.
Interesting. All right.
They're Italian bees too, but
yeah, right.
But the Italian bees leave wine bottles and lasagna all over the place.
I had a question. I have a question for you about this picture that's up on the screen now. So was the land where you grew up, was it always swampy like this? Or was there a part of it where the house was must have been less swampy, or did this only happen like seasonally?
It was, I think it's called woodland forest. And it's all very flat, but there are some little ridges. And precocins are the kind of swampy things in between, and sometimes you would have freshets to come in and uh, cut you off. That's why the whole area was called the islands. But from where we built our house, there was, and the Smithwick house, which was very, very old, that was a little bit of a ridge. And but between Granddaddy's house and our house, we're on that same ridge. And it was like 5 miles from there to Devil's Gut. And that was not built on at all. There was one place where they called it the quarter field. It was had about an acre. That was a little knob somewhere back there. And they would grow something there. I don't know what for, and they made their canoes out of cypresses and would paddle back and forth and go all the way to the gut sometimes and set up weirs like the Indians did and catch fish and stuff. But most of it was, it didn't look as scrubby as this. It had huge old growth cypresses and tupelos. And a lot of it was boggy and watery, but it wasn't always dry, and it wasn't always wet. Some of it was wet, but I don't know how to describe it really. It's just
It's called precosins.
Yeah, the precosins and anyway, I think it's called lowland forest, or some kind of forest. It's not maritime forest. It's inland on the outer banks. But if you look on a Google map, I think you'll see a lot of trees along both sides of the Roanoke River. It's not open land at all. It's cypresses and tupelo and some kind of hardwoods on the where it doesn't flood much. But then the soil, there are 3 ways that they would clear the land. One was cutting it down and then burning the roots, whatever. One was dynamite, and the other one was just pulling it up with a team of oxen. And it was just, and then you had nothing but sandy soil. It wasn't very good soil, growing stuff. Granddaddy the railroad track went along what became Highway 64, and he would order boxcar loads of guano from South America or somewhere, come into Norfolk on ships, and come down and stop at his end of his lane and unload it. Train go on. And also that everybody used to have manure spreaders, because everybody had cows and horses and mules. And in 1941, when we had the flood, it destroyed the buggy that Granddaddy had under a shelter. It used to have horses and stuff. And they used to have fences made out of those crisscross, I can't remember what you call those fences. And split rail fences, yeah. And then they had wire fences and they had board fences. But then when tractors came in, all the fences came down. And because they couldn't turn around at the ends of the roads, and got rid of the fences.
Hey, Rob, it's Matt. I have a question about technique.
Yes.
I was fascinated to see you holding the box over your head, standing on the almost the top rung of the ladder. And I was wondering if it would be more effective if you stood on the top rung of the ladder.
It was actually like Ricky and Stella can attest. It was comical on many levels. But when I mean standing there, like when I was coming down, like I was obviously not on the top rung, but my shins were on the top rung, and it was pretty soggy. So the ladder like kind of like seemed to like tilt a little bit as I was coming down with this box of bees over my head. And I swear I thought I was going to break my shin. Like it was leaning so hard into the rung. Yeah, it was definitely like. Yeah, it felt bad on many levels. And that video continued actually because we didn't, of course, get the queen. And so you could tell because they immediately reclumped right up on the branch.
Oh dear.
And so Sandy cut the branch down and then, but it didn't come all the way down. So it was sort of hanging like this. And then we went back up there and I was scooping them in my hands into the box. And then Amy did the same thing. And that felt wrong, like to be like scooping bees with your hands. I had gloves on, but still felt.
The only thing that would make that worse is if you stepped on a snake when you got back down.
It looked like the beginnings of one of those videos of, hey guys, watch this. You know?
Totally.
It was a crazy night though, because they're like, oh my God, there's a swarm over there. And immediately like Amy and Rob were like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get the ladder and we're going to get up there and we're going to grab the branch and then you're going to do the box. And I was like, stop it. Don't do anything. And I was on the phone calling Ryan. I was like, there's a swarm and they've got this crazy plan. And he was like, look, I'm 10 minutes away. Just tell them to wait. I'm turning around. I'm going to head to your house. I was like, okay. And then he came, but I don't know that he was all that helpful, but he lended some calm to it. Yeah. It was a crazy night.
So Rob, next time I loaned you my ladder, I'm going to have to sign you. I'm going to have you sign a release.
Exactly.
A waiver.
Yeah.
Liability.
Yeah.
Make sure you film it, Brand.
This has been great. Thank you so much, Rob and Alice. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks all.
Fun.
Thanks.
Good fun.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Alice.
You're welcome.